Pasuk Beis, the pasuk concluded in Pashas Vayakel, Kol osa bo melacha yumos. Whoever does melacha, this creative activity on Shabbos, he's subject to the death penalty. And what is the penalty? The Gemara Mishnah tells us in Sanhedrin the 4 levels of death penalty. There's skila, sreifa, hereg, v'chenek. Either you die, the person's put to death by stoning. Doesn't mean you pummel the body with stones. It means that a person is put on an elevation the equivalent of his height. His hands are tied behind his back, and his feet are tied together, and he's pushed off backwards. And when he falls, inevitably he'll break his neck, and he dies instantaneously. If he doesn't die if he breaks his neck, they take a big stone, very heavy stone, put it on his chest, and they put it, and he's crushed to death. But the body is intact. That skila. Sreifa is not burning the body, because that's called desecrating the human being. And the Gemara says, how do we know sreifa doesn't mean burning by fire? Because the Torah says, you must love your fellow as you love yourself. So desecrating the body would be in contradiction to So what is sreifa? They take molten lead and they pour it down his throat. It's literally instantaneous death. Then this hereg is decapitation, and strangulation is the least of the 4. If one violates the Shabbos, one is liable for skila, which is the most severe of the 4 death penalties. If one does idolatry, one is subject to skila, which is the most severe of the 4 death penalties. So Shabbos and avodah zarah and idolatry are on par. In terms of the level of liability, they're both skila. The Gemara tells us that a person does not observe the Shabbos. We're talking about deliberately. He's chovid avodah zarah. He's the equivalent of an idolater. So Rashi and Chulin explains why. Because that the Jew was chosen to be the testament to the world that Hashem is the creator. So if a person does not observe Shabbos, it's if he's denying that Hashem is the creator of the world. Denying that Hashem is the creator is the equivalent of being an idolater, and therefore it has that level of severity. Therefore, a person b'chal Shabbos, he's a mumul chol Torah kula. If a person doesn't eat kosher, doesn't observe, doesn't sit in the sukkah, doesn't put on tefillin, he's considered an apostate, but only in that particular area. But in terms of his totality being disconnected from the Jewish people, that's only if he doesn't observe the Shabbos. Of course, that's the core of the Jew, believing in the God, that Hashem is the creator of existence. So just as the pagan believes that God is not associated, it's the deity which dictates existence, it's not Hashem. Identically, the one who doesn't observe the Shabbos, he's denying that Hashem is the creator of the world, because he's not the testament to the world, which he's chosen to be the testament through his behavior, that Hashem, as Hashem refrained, you, my chosen people, are supposed to refrain. That's the concept. And it concludes, you're not permitted to kindle fire in your communities beyond Shabbos, on Shabbos. So the Gemara discusses, Rashi over here explains why is the Torah singling out it already says it says you're not permitted to do this creative activity. So Rashi cites 2 opinions, which is Gemara and Shabbos. That of all the 39 classifications of creative activity, for every one of them, if you violate, it carries the liability of skilo, and inadvertent is what? Is chatos. One has to bring the chatos. Kindling is a lesser violation, therefore it doesn't have the death penalty. And one inadvertently, if you violate, you kindle on Shabbos and you think it's Sunday morning, there's no chatos. One doesn't bring a sin offering. That's one opinion. The other opinion, normally in the normal circumstances, let's say the Torah says a person is not permitted to eat chelev. Chelev is the non-kosher fat in a kosher species. Let's say a person eats a kazais of chelev inadvertently. He has to bring the chatos. What about he eats multiple kazaisin, volumes of olives, during one unawareness, he believes this meal is kosher, it's kosher fat, it turns out to be chaylev. And he eats during one unawareness 10 kezesim of chaylev. He brings one chatos. Since it was one unawareness and the violation was the same violation, one should not eat chaylev, he brings one chatos. Why? Because the lav, it's under one category, one should not eat chaylev. Let's say a person, at that meal, he was served chaylev and he was served dam, blood, either animal blood, fish, fowl blood from a bird. That's a separate lav. And a person eats that. It carries the liability of kares. And it's during one unawareness. How many chatos does he have to bring? He has to bring 2. Because it's a different category. He violated 2 categories of negative commandments, which each carries the liability of kares, deliberate. Anything which has liability of kares on a deliberate level, on an inadvertent level, one has to bring a chatos. When it comes to Shabbos, there says one lav, lo sasuko melocha. One is not permitted to do creative activity on Shabbos. It's one lav. So we have 39 categories of creative activity. But since it's all under one heading, of one should not do creative activity on Shabbos, person wakes up Sunday morning and he violates 10 of the categories. And then he realizes afterwards, it was Shabbos, it wasn't Sunday morning. How many chatos does he bring? Seemingly, according to what we're saying, he should bring 1. Because it's under one heading, it's one classification, it's during one unawareness. But since the Torah singles out, you should not kindle fire in your communities. What the Torah is saying, that just as here where it's being individualized, this love, and for this love, you'd be liable for a chatos, it's revealing that even though it's expressed as one love, we see that one negative commandment as if it's 39 negative commandments stated. Therefore, during one inadvertency, one has to bring 39 chatos. One has to bring 39 sin offerings. That's the opinion, lechalek. It takes the one lav and it divides it into 39 categories of negative commandments, as if the Torah says 39 times, addressing each one of the creative activities, you're not permitted to do this creative activity. That's the opinion, lechalek yotzos. We rule lechalek yotzos, that the transgression of kindling is the same as all the others. And the reason why it's singled out is to reveal on the whole category that we see it as 39 categories rather than as one category. And these are like sub-levels of that same category. Okay, that's the understanding of l'chalik yotzos. It divides it into multiple categories. Why does the Torah choose kindling? It should say you should not cook in your communities. Why does it choose kindling? Right? I mean, the 39 categories. But yet the Torah to elucidate, to clarify the understanding of this, that just as this is individualized, all 39 are individualized. Why do we speak about kindling? We could have chosen plowing, planting, any of the others. Why this particular? Now, according to the opinion that it's lav yotzos, that the reason why it's singled out is because it has a lesser consequence, lesser liability. Why does it have lesser liability? Kindling, lesser than all the other 38. For cooking, planting, reaping, any of the others. Processing, all the liabilities are what? Is kares, but Mises Besdin. Death penalty, skilo. This kindling is less than all the others. Why? So the way it's explained, the Rishonim explain, the way the early commentators explain it. What's the halacha? What's the law? You do a creative activity in a destructive context, rather than constructive. It's destructive. You have no liability. Why? Because that's called mekalkel. If you do it in a context of destructive, which is called damaging, mekalkel doesn't have a liability on a Torah level. Rabbinically, you're not permitted. On a Torah level, there's no liability. Why? Because all the creative activities which we learn, which are not permitted Shabbos, they're all extrapolated from the Mishkan. Just as in the Mishkan, every one of these categories were constructive, not destructive. Identically, to carry the liability of violating Shabbos, it has to be in the same context as the Mishkan. So if it's constructive, it's called Melechas Machsheves, it's a malacha which has value, then you violated Shabbos. But if it's not Melechas Machsheves, if it's destructive, then there is no liability of Chatos. There's no, on Torah level, there's no liability whatsoever. Okay? So if you analyze every one of the two malachos, which are very interesting, very unique, you plant, you reap. The action itself is what? Is something positive. You sow, you dye, you cook. The action itself is positive. It's creative. It contributes. It enhances. Okay? Now, the two categories of malach which carry the death penalty, the way we rule, transporting. If you transport an item from domain to domain, you have an item in Rishus HaYochid, private domain. Private domain doesn't mean private property. Private domain means a location which is circumscribed with 3 walls. And the item is lying on the ground, and you pick it up, with an intent to take it into public domain. Public domain means a domain has to meet certain criteria, but if it meets that criteria and you come to bring it to rest in that domain, you transport it from domain to domain. You're not permitted to transfer from private domain to public domain or from public domain to private domain. But the intent has to be when you remove it from the domain, is to bring it to the other domain. If you're in Rishus HaRabim, if you're in public domain, and you lift it from its location and take it 4 cubits in public domain, and after 4 cubits you stop, and when you began walking, you took the item. It was you intended to bring it 4 amos, 4 cubits, in violation of transporting Shabbos, carries liability of the death penalty, inadvertent. It has liability of chatos. That's the halacha. Now, what's unusual when you transport an item from location to location? The object is the same object. You haven't made any alteration, positive alteration, negative alteration. You just took the item from domain to domain. That's all you did. And in the words of Rishonim, this is referred to as malacha gerua. It's a deficient. It doesn't really have the profile of all the other 39 malachos. And as a result of that, it's classified as malacha gerua. Although it's a deficient malacha, nevertheless, it carries the liability has the same liability as all the other, which are fully creative. You made a change in a positive way to the item itself. 1 second. The Gemara says in Shabbos, how do we know you're not permitted to transport from public domain to private domain or vice versa? Because the Levium, when they were wagons, and when they transported the beams of the Mishkan, they would load the beams onto the wagons, and when they would erect the Mishkan, when they camped, they would erect the Mishkan, they would take the beams off the wagon, to erect the beams in the location they were supposed to erect the Mishkan. Now, the wagons themselves, because of the height of the wagons and the walls, were classified as Rishus HaYochid. It was Rishus HaYochid. The location outside the wagons was Rishus HaRabim. Rishus HaRabim. So the Leviim, when let's say they dismantled the Mishkan, they took the beams from Rishus HaRabim and they loaded them onto the wagon. So they transported the beams from Rishus HaRabim to Rishus HaYochid. When they would have to erect the Mishkan, they would take the beams off the wagon from Rishus HaYochid, and they bring the beams into Rishus HaRabim. In public domain, that's where they erect the Mishkan. So since we see in both directions, therefore, you're liable whether you take it from Rishus HaRabim to Rishus HaYochid, public domain to public domain. That's the Gemara. So Tosas has a question in Shabbos. What do we have to learn from the Levium? We see from there, you're not permitted to take an object from domain to domain. What does the Gemara have to be so specific that they took the beams from Rishus HaRabim to Rishus HaYochid or vice versa? You're not, from there we see, you're not permitted to take an object from domain to domain. Just from knowing that you're not permitted to take from Rishus HaRabim to Rishus HaYochid or vice versa, saying that, oh, that should be sufficient. What do we have to speak about both sides of the equation? That's Tosas' question. So Tosas answers, because transporting is unique, that it's a deficient belacha. Doesn't have the same creative effect, because the object is the same object. So you would think, if the Torah says would only say one direction, it's a chidush. The Torah doesn't want to go from private domain to public domain, but maybe from public domain to private domain, maybe that, yes. Therefore, it has to speak about both sides of the equation, that just as the Levim took the beams off the wagon, which was Shusayach, Shusarabim, in addition, they took it from Shusarabim to Shusayach. So we're speaking about both sides of the equation. That's why the Gemara has to fully flesh it out to understand, because this is not a classical malacha, which one is a violation of Shabbos. That's Tos's answer. Now, kindling, what is kindling? Every other malacha we say, when you cook, it's an enhancement. You dye, it's an enhancement. You build, it's an enhancement. What about when you take fuel and you burn something? Two things are happening simultaneously. Something is destructive, but it has constructive value. You're burning fuel for the sake of illumination, light. You're burning fuel to create heat because you want to cook. So in itself, what the item, the object is being destroyed. So it has a certain destructive aspect to it, characteristic. So because of that destructive characteristic, that's why it's called efficient. That is the basis for the opinion why the Torah singles out it does not have the same liability as all the other 38 creative activities. Of course, all the other 38 categories, it's all creative. There's no destructive aspect to it. Creative, constructive. Here it's destructive for the sake of constructive. That's the difference between the two. And transporting, there's no destructive aspect, but there's no creative aspect because it's the same object. So therefore, everybody agrees you transport, the liability is the same as all the others because it has a positive value. There's nothing destructive about it. But kindling, because it's destructive, therefore, it has a lesser liability than all the others. Okay, that's the understanding. What about if the way we rule halacha, we rule that it has the same liability as the others? Why does the Torah single out exactly for this reason? Because you may think that kindling, because it has this destructive component, maybe therefore it should not have the same liability. The Torah singling it out that since it has its value is for constructive purposes, although the fuel itself is being destroyed, nevertheless it has the same liability as the other 38 constructive, creative activities for that reason. That's the understanding. We know that food-related activities are permitted on Yom Tov. Permitted to cook, to bake, to transport from domain to domain. Okay? So Beis Shammai is of the opinion that you're only permitted to transport food items. Let's say you want to transport a lulav from domain to domain on Yom Tov. Beis Shammai says you're not permitted because it's not a food item. You want to transport a Sefer Torah. These are the examples given in the Mishnah. You need a Sefer Torah in shul, and you want to take it from your home through public domain to take it to the shul, you're not permitted because that's not food related. If you want to carry a child who can't walk, which is considered carrying, if you carry that child from domain to domain, you're in violation of Yom Tov, you've transported. Basil says, we disagree. When the Torah says food related, it doesn't mean necessarily food, it has to be food item, as long as it accommodates your need, which enhances your Yom Tov, it has a positive purpose, you're permitted. Therefore, it's called mitoch. Just as the Torah permits it when it's specifically for ochel nefesh, for when it's directly food related, anything which is a semblance of food related, Torah also permits. Okay? So Rashi explains, what does this mean? Tosfos argues. Rashi says, let's say a person just wants to carry stones from domain to domain. That's what you want to do. Rashi says you're permitted. Even though it has no purpose, no value. When you carry a child that has value, you carry a lulav that has value, Sefer Torah has value. But carrying stones, well, you don't need those stones. You don't need the stones as a paperweight. Rashi says you're not in violation. Because just as the Torah permits you to transport the food item, the Torah permits you to transport the stone. Tosfos vehemently disagrees. And he cites the Gemara in Pesachim, because the Gemara says over there, the person cooks on Yom Tov, right before sundown. And the food would only be edible after sundown. You get malchus. you get malchus. Why? Because since you cannot benefit from that act of cooking on Yom Tiv, you're in violation of cooking. So you see over there that unless it has a value on Yom Tiv, you're in violation. So how could you say if you transport stones from the domain to domain on Yom Tiv? Even though it has no value, you're not in violation. We see clearly from the Mishnah and Psachim that if you cook before sundown and the food will only be edible after sundown, you're in violation. That's Tosafos' question on Rashi. So they answer Rashi as what we just said. Rashi is in agreement. What's transporting? Transporting is a melacha grua. It's a deficient melacha. If you do an act which is creative, which is something which is at a higher level of value, you have to be able to benefit from it on Yom Tov. And since cooking is enhancement, or baking is enhancement, you have to be able to benefit on Yom Tov. And if you can't, it's not permitted. However, the stone is the same stone. All you did is you changed its location. It was a public domain, now it's a private domain, vice versa. So since the actually result or the effect of that action is at a lesser level, therefore you don't need that component that you have to be able to benefit from it. Because when we start from get-go, you're starting already with something which has its characteristic, its profile is a lesser malacha than all the other malachas. That's how they explain Rashi. Rashi is not speaking across the board by all activities which are permitted for Ochel Nefesh, specifically speaking about transporting. That's how they answer Rashi. Ask the question, transporting dalam shusarabim. You take an object, you're stationary in shusarabim, and you walk 4 cubits, and you stop. And you where the object is in your pocket or in your hand. You're in violation of transporting. So Mar asks, where do we find Havoras dalam shusarabim in the Mishkan? Where do we find? And the Gemara goes through many situations, and Mar says that's not it. So Mar concludes, how do we know Havoras dalam shusarabim? It's not learned from the Mishkan. Halochem Sinai. It was ordained to Moshe Sinai that you're not permitted to transport in public domain, although you're not taking from domain to domain. Halochem Sinai. So again, it has this novel concept. The others, at least, you find it in Mishkan. They took the beams off the wagons, put them on the wagons. But here, you're in the public domain. We don't find such a situation in the Mishkan. Or concludes, Halochem Sinai. It was ordained to Moshe to Sinai. It's the equivalent of that, although it was not in the Mishkan. Mentioned that whenever you transport from domain to domain, the original intent has to be when you take that object, you remove it from its original location to take it into the other domain. But if the original, when you remove it, it was not to take it to the other domain, and after you take it from its location, you have a change of mind to take it in public domain, you're not in violation. It's called akiram naslo niach. When you remove it, it has to be having in mind you're going to bring it to the other domain. So the Gemara explains, what are we talking about? If a person takes something off his dining room table and he wants to put it somewhere else in that room, and after he removes it, he has in mind a change of mind. I'm going out the front door, and he brings it to rest in the Rishus HaRabim. You're not in violation because when you remove it, it has to be with the intent to take it to the other location. That's a prerequisite to be in violation of transporting. So now, if Sukkot falls out on Shabbos the first day, we don't take a lulav. Why? Because it's a rabbinic offense. Because we're concerned. The Gemara says Shemei Yavir Dalav Shusarabim. Because you may transport that lulav in public domain. Because one has to wave the lulav, and if one is not aware, is not really trained or taught how to wave it, you may forget for a moment. You may take that lulav to a person to teach you how to wave it. Therefore, rabbinically, offense. One doesn't take the lulav on Yom Tov if it falls out on Shabbos. Okay. So Tosafos asks a question. Why does the Gemara say Shem Yavin Rishus HaRabim? You may transport it in public domain. Say you may take it from Rishus HaYom to Rishus HaRabim, which is the case. Where do you have a lulav? You have a lulav in your home. You may take the lulav from your home into public domain. What are we talking about? You may transport it in public domain for 4 cubits. That's Tosafos' question. Rashi very rarely asks a question. Rashi is a commentator. In regard to this halacha, Rashi asked the question himself. What does the Gemara say? You may transport it 4 cubits in public domain. Say you may transport it from Rishus HaYoch to Rishus HaRabim. So Tosas answers, Rashi answers, that because it's speaking about he picked up the lulav, not to take it in public domain. And then he had to change his mind, took it in public domain. So in terms of transporting from domain to domain, you're not in violation, right? Because there's a prerequisite to only time you're in violation from domain to domain. The original removal had to be in mind to take to the other domain. But if initially I take the lulav and my mindset is not to take it into public domain, and then subsequently, before I walk out the door, I say, I'm taking it out the door, you're not in violation of transporting from domain to domain. However, transporting Rishus HaRabim, although the original taking was not for that purpose, you're in violation. That's Rashi. Therefore, the Gemara says, the concern is you may transport in public domain because that prerequisite of intent, you don't need to be in violation of transporting from domain to domain. That's Rashi. Tosas goes and says, I disagree. Because ultimately, what is the malacha of transporting public domain? It's the same prohibition as transporting from domain to domain. If that's the case, the prerequisite of intent, as it applies from domain to domain, it applies even regarding transporting Rishus HaRabim. Therefore, he's not satisfied with Rashi's answer. You following what I'm saying? So the way it's explained, what are they arguing? What's the argument, Rashi and Tosas? We have this. The argument is, what is the basis for transporting in public domain? The Gemara says, Halacha Mishum Sinai. It was ordained to Moshe Sinai. It's not learned from the Mishnah. Tosas explains what was ordained to Moshe Sinai was that transporting from domain to domain, from in Rishus HaRabim, public domain, taking it from its original location, 4 cubits, you're taking it out of its domain. That's the equivalent of taking it from domain to domain. So if that's the case, you must meet all the prerequisites of taking something from domain to domain. Means you have to have in mind you're taking it from one location to bring to the other location. Rashi learns, no, that's not the understanding. Halacha Mishum Sinai, when the Torah ordained it at Sinai, has nothing to do with transporting from domain to domain. You're not permitted to do it. As a result of that, it doesn't have to meet the criteria of transporting from domain to domain. That's the machlokas, Rashi and Tosas. That's the way it's explained.